continuation. Next is about head skeleton. The head of the insect loses its primary segmentation during the post-embryonic development due to enormous sclerotization. The head becomes a hard skeletal capsule. It bears externally a set of sensory and gnathal appendages. The sense organs include a pair of antennae, a pair of compound eyes, and 2 to 3 ocelli. The gnathal appendages comprises of a pair of mandibles, a pair of maxillae, and a labia. The gnathal appendages constitute collectively along the labrum and hypopharynx a well-elaborated feeding apparatus. The position of the mouthparts in relation to the body axis differs in different groups of insects. The mouthparts may project downward, forward, or backward, and the head accordingly is designated as hypognathous or orthopteroid insects. Prognathous, some dipteran flies and larval coleoptera, and opistognathous, hemiptera, Thysanoptera. When the head sutures, the head capsule of matured insects is differentiated into several regions by the sutures. The sutures are nothing but the secondary developed fine grooves. Although the true nature and the morphological significance of the sutures is still incompletely understood, they are inflections or merely external impressions of the internal stiff cuticular ridges which provide mechanical support to the cranial wall. Some workers have taken into account the sutures as the intersegmental lines, but now it is well established that these structures are the product of sclerotization, and except the post-occipital suture, others have no metameric significance. The common sutures of the insect head are described below. The clipiolabral suture. The suture represents the lower margin of the clipius. The labrum is hanging down from this suture. It bears a prominent ridge internally. The ridge possesses an apodeme at the center. The apodeme provides an insertion to the anterior retractor muscles of the labrum. The clipiofrontal or epistomal suture. It occurs between the clipius and the frons. It bears laterally the anterior tentorial pits. It internally bears a strong inflection. This inflection strengthens the lower part of the head against the stretching of the mandibles. Then the epicranial suture. It is a composite one. It appears in the form of an inverted Y above the facial region in most of the insect. The stem is known as the coronal and the lateral arms and the frontal suture. The epicranial suture is partially or even completely reduced in some insects. It is totally lacking from the head of pterygotes. Snodgrass in 1935 and Duporte in 1957 stated that the epicranial suture represents merely the line of weakness and can be said in true sense as the ecdysial suture. It does not bear the skeletal ridge on the inner surface and therefore does not provide either a site for muscle attachment or mechanical support to the head capsule. And the occipital suture, it is the horseshoe or U-shaped suture, well evident on the posterior part of the head of the orthopteroid insects. It starts from posterior articulations of the mandibles of other side. Both the arms, after running a long distance, join one another above the occipital foramen. It separates the genal area from the post-genal area of the lateral region of the head. It also differentiates the vertex from the occiput in posterior region of the head. It forms an internal ridge, strengthening the posterior epicranial wall. In post-occipital suture, it embraces the occipital foramen magnum from the dorsal and lateral sides. Each end of the suture merges in the hyposomal suture in ventral region. This site is well defined due to the presence of the posterior temporal pits. It possesses internally a strong epidemal ridge, the post-occipital ridge. It provides a site for the attachment of prothoracic muscles which move a pair of ventrolateral condyles. The neck membrane is firmly attached to this ridge. The condyles articulate with the neck sclerites. It is the only suture having the metameric significance. It alone marks the fusion of the maxillary and labial segments of the head. The frontogenal or subocular suture. It develops on each lateral region of the head. It starts from the junction of the clipiofrontal and the subgenal suture. It terminates in the close vicinity of the lower margin of each compound eye. It is virtually well evident in the orthopteroid insects. Then the subgenal suture. These sutures occur on the lateral side of the head. Each suture joins the posterior tentorial pit with the anterior tentorial pit of the same side. Each suture is divisible into two parts. One part of the subgenal suture is called the hypostomal suture. The hypostomal suture runs from the posterior tentorial pit up to the posterior articulation of the mandible. The other part of the subgenal suture is called the pleurostomal suture. The pleurostomal suture arches over the mandible and finally joins with the frontoclypeal and the frontogenal sutures just above the anterior articulation of the mandible. Internally, the subgenal sutures form the submarginal subgenal ridges. Each ridge extends from the posterior tentorial pit to a point just above the anterior articulation of the mandible. The subgenal sutures strengthen the radial wall along the lines of attachment of the nasal appendages. Then the ocular suture. The sutures are the annular grooves around the compound eyes. They form the skeletal ridges internally. Then the antennal sutures, the marginal depressed ring along the antennal sockets are known as the antennal sutures. These sutures give internally the submarginal ridge. The submarginal ridge in a large number of insects bears a pivot-like process known as the antennifer. The antennifer provide articulation to the antenna. The head sclerites or areas. The cuticular areas can be seen on the external surface of the head. They become well evident after dechitination when treated with aqueous KOH at high temperature. These areas of the head capsule are also known as the head sclerites. The sclerites represent the intersutural areas. The head of the generalized insect is typically exhibiting the following sclerites, like the labrum. It is widely discussed structure of the head. Some workers have regarded it as a fused segmental appendage, which is now universally accepted as a sclerite of the head. It is freely attached to lower margin of the clypeus by the clipiolabral suture, generally hanged over the mouth or the preoral cavity, and also termed as an upper lip, particularly in the mandibulate insect. In the fluid feeding insects, it undergoes various modifications. Internally, it forms anterior part of the epipharyngeal wall of the preoral cavity. It is internally lined with the gustatory receptors and can be moved upwards, downwards, and be pulled and pushed to some extent due to the elastic nature of the suture and muscle innervation. The labrum is innervated by the following three types of muscles. The compressor labral. They may occur in a pair on lateral sides or a single median one, which one the compressor labral. They are attached by one end on the anterior and by the other end on the posterior wall of the labrum. The compressor bring the retraction, prolongation and contraction of the labrum. The anterior labral. They are a paired but unbranched labral muscles. They originate from the inner surface of the frons. They move the labrum on forward direction. The posterior labral. They are paired but branched labral muscles. Anterior labral. They are the paired but unbranched labral muscles. They originate from the inner surface of the frons. They move the labrum in forward direction. Then the posterior labral. They are the paired but branched labral muscles. They originate from the anterior lateral region of the frons. These muscles pull the labrum backward. And the clypeus. The sclerite is demarcated by the clipiolabral and clipiofrontal sutures from the anterior and posterior sides. It thus occupies the position in between the anterior labral and posterior frontal sclerites. In some insects, it is completely or partially divided into two pairs, by a transverse suture. The posterior part is termed as the postclypeus and the anterior part is termed as the anticlypeus. Both parts of the clypeus can be seen in case of crickets. The postclypeus modifies into a convex process termed as the gingivimus of the mandible. This is the scleret of the head on which arise the cydalial dilator muscles. Then the frons. It extends from the anterior clipio-frontal suture to the posterior frontal suture. In the orthoceroid insects, it possesses the median ocellus. In some cases, it may bear the lateral ocelli also. Whenever the clipio-frontal suture remains ill-defined, the anterior tentorial pits reveal the demarcation of this sclera from the clipio region. Cockroaches. The frons represents typically an upper facial region of the head. The pharyngeal dilators, labral, hypopharyngeal muscles, and the adductors of mandibles are usually inserted on the middle of the frons. Then the epirhinium. The epirhinial suture separates the epirhinium from the frons. It represents the entire upper region or top of the head. It extends from the anterior frontal to the posterior occipital suture. Above the frons, it is divided into the coronal suture into two identical lateral plates known as the parietals. The parietals are characterized by bearing the antennae, lateral ocelli, and the compound eye. The posterior undivided region of the epicardium is known as vertex, which forms top of the head. The independent status of the vertex as the sclera is still controversial. Then the occiput. It is the U-shaped posterior or hinder cuticular band. It represents the area from the occipital to the post-occipital suture. In the higher insects, however, the occipital suture is obscure. Then the post-occiput. The occipital foramen is enriched from the dorsal and lateral region by a narrow sclerite. The post-occipital. It lies between the occiput and the neck. The post-occiput is marked off from the occiput by a transverse post-occipital suture. And the post-occipital suture remains absent. The posterior tentorial pits separate the post-occiput from the occiput. The dorsal thoracic muscles are attached to the endoskeletal ridge of the post-occipital suture. These muscles attribute the head freely. The anterolateral inner margin of the post-occiput produces small processes. These structures are termed as the occipital condyles. Each condyle articulates with the anterior lateral cervical sclerite. The genae and the subgenal areas. The genae represent the lateral areas of the head. On either side, the genae extend from the compound eye to the mandibular trochanter. The hinder part develops into the socket to accommodate the mandibular condyle. Posterior to the occipital suture, each lateral gena is commonly called as the postgena. Each postgena provides the condylar articulation for the maxillae. The subgenal area above and below the mandibles can be referred to as the pleurostoma and hypostoma, respectively. These areas are separated in some insects by the suture, the hypostomal suture. Similarly, the pleurostomal one separates the pleurostoma from bases of mandibles. Next, the ocular sclerates. They form a cuticular ring around each compound eye. The antennal sclerates. They form an annulus at the base of each antennae. The antennal sclerates are well developed in the Plecoptera. Then the mandibular trochanter. It occurs quite distinctly between the mandibular base and the pleurostoma or the pleurostomal suture. Next is about tentorium. It is an endoskeleton structure. It is composed of 3 pairs of arms. The anterior, posterior and dorsal tentorial arms. The anterior tentorial arms develop from the anterior tentorial pits in the subgenal or epistomal suture. The posterior tentorial arms arise from the posterior tentorial pits in the lower ends of the post-occipital suture, the dorsal tentorial arms take origin in the form of secondary outgrowths of the anterior arms. All these tentorial arms unite in the middle, forming an expanded central skeleton platform. It may simply constitute a structure resembling the X or the Greek letter pi. The presence of a broader tentorial plate occurs commonly in the pterygote insects and is commonly known as the corporotendorium. The anterior and the posterior arms of the tendorium vary largely in their size from one group of insects to another. In some orthopteran insects like the cockroaches, a pair of median processes arise at the bases of the anterior arms and after union form an anterior bridge. Similar type of skeletal bridge can also be produced by the posterior arms and is extensively developed in the termite soldier. The tendorium is bracing the epicranial walls. It serves as a site for the attachment to the ventral abductor muscles of the gnathal appendage, the retractor muscle of the hypopharynx, and also to the ventral dilators of the stomodia. In most of the insects, the antennal muscles are attached to the dorsal forms of the tendorium. Then the pterygote muscle insects, no homologous structure can be seen in tendorium. Therefore, seems to be an important evolutionary advancement in the pterygote insects. It appears to be formed of tergal and sternal elements. The anterior arms developed as the sternal apophyses and posterior arms as the tergal apodemes. Modifications of head capsule. The anterior frontoclypeal and posterior lateral as well as the ventral regions of the head capsule are greatly modified in some insects. Frontoclypeal region. The epistomal suture is wanting in cockroaches and some other insects, in which the clypeal region can be separated from the frontal region by the position of anterior temporal pits. Sometimes the frontal sutures are also indistinct. In the Hemiptera, Hymenoptera and Lepidopteran larvae, the frons is greatly reduced or suppressed. In these insects, on the basis of position of dilators of cybarium or that of buccal cavity, the clypeal region can be recognized. Similarly, the frontal region can be identified by the position of a median ocellus and origin of labral muscles. Then hypostomal bridge. In Hymenoptera, Heteroptera, Diptera and Lepidopteran larvae, the labium is basically separated from the foramen magnum due to the development of hypostomal lobes, forming a ventral hypostomal bridge. Cephalic appendages. There are two types of cephalic appendages in the insects. The preoral appendages are the antennae, while the postoral appendages are the mandibles, maxillae and labium. The antennae. The insect head is characterized by possessing a single pair of antennae. They are the paired appendages of the second preoral or so-called antennal segment according to the classical theory of the head segmentation. The antennae of the insects are homologous with the antennules of the crustaceans. The antennae are uniramous, segmented and mobile paired structures. They are basically fixed into the deep antennal sockets. Each antennal socket is provided with the external antennal sclerite with the antennal suture and the internal broad membrane, the antechoria. Each antennal socket occupies the position behind the respective ocellus in the orthopteroid insects, but may shift from the anterior region of the parietals to the facial region approaching the frontal suture or even the mandibular basis. The antennae are known to be absent in Protuna and also in larvae of most of the Hymenoptera. Okay, then cephalic appendages we were learning. Then the structure, the antennae is irrespective of an insect species, typically composed of a basal scape, middle pedicel, and a terminal flagella. The scape and pedicel are the single segmented divisions. The flagellum is the multi-segmented long part of the antennae. The number of the segments of the flagellum are increasing in the successive instars, suggesting secondary or tertiary subdivisions segmented throughout the life. All segments of the flagellum are alike in most of the insects. In some cases, like the calcid flies, the flagellum is differentiated into three regions. The proximal region is composed of the ring segment, the middle region is composed of the peg-like segments forming the funicle, and the distal region is composed of the swollen segments forming the terminal or distal club. Then the scape bears two apodemes, one dorsal and the other ventral. Both the apodemes are approaching closely the anthocorium membrane. They are spindle-shaped and provide site for attachment to the muscles innervating the scape of antennae. The pedicel bears a slender apodeme approximately. It is inserted by the flexor muscles of the flagellum. The flagellum is devoid of endoskeleton processes and muscles. Articulation of the antenna. The scape is responsible for the articulation of the entire antenna in various directions. There are two types of articulations, in which one type of articulation can be seen in the gryllothalpids. Lateroventral process is held in the groove on the rim of antennal sockets along with fused cuticular process. The anthocorium may also take part in the process of articulation, in which the rest of the base of the scape is embedded. In other insects, the scape is articulated by a pivot-like process of the antennal ridge known as the antennifer. The antennifer fits into the basal groove of the scape. The scape is inserted freely into the membrane and the anthocorium so that the antenna articulate in all directions. The musculature of the antenna. In some insects, from Thysanura to Altericota, each antenna is innervated by four muscles, two extrinsic and the remaining two intrinsic. So the extrinsic muscles include the levator and the depressor muscle. Each of them is composed of two branches, one inner and the other outer. The extrinsic muscles arise from the anterior tentorial arms, or as seen in some cases, from both the anterior and the dorsal arms. The levator muscles are inserted into the dorsal apodeme of the scape. The depressor muscles are inserted into the ventral apodeme of scape. The intrinsic muscles are also of two types, the flexor and the extensor. It is apparent that these muscles move the flagellum and therefore called as the flexor and extensor of the flagellum. Both the flexor and extensor muscles arise from the base of the scape. The flexor muscles is inserted in the outer side, while the extensor on the inner side of the base of the pedicel. No segment of the flagellum bears any type of muscles, and it is a peculiar feature of all Pterygota and Thysanura. In rest of the Pterygota, besides the scape and pedicel, all segments of the flagellum are provided with the intrinsic muscles. Each segment bears 5 muscles which arise from the base of one segment and terminate in that of the other. The types of antennae. The antennae is highly modified in different groups of insects. They possess the taxonomic and dimorphic significance in some insects, particularly the Coleoptera and Diptera. They are classified into 13 types, like cetaceous antennae. The flagellum looked like a bristle due to the gradual reduction in the size of the segments, odonata. Then the filiform antennae. The flagellum appears as a thread-like structure made up of uniform thin segments, Blattidae. Then the moniliform antennae. The flagellum is composed of the globose-shaped segments, providing a beaded or necklace-like appearance to the entire antennae. Termites, Caloterms. Then the serrate antennae. First, cetaceous antennae, filiform antennae, moniliform antennae. The flagellum is composed of a globose-shaped segments, providing a beaded or necklace-like appearance to the entire antennae. Then the serrate antennae. The flagellum consists of triangular segments with eccentric arrangement, leaving the free ends of the segments freely on one side. which appear as the teeth of a saw. Then the pectinate or flabellate antennae. The individual segments of the flagellum are extending on only one side of the long process, and thus antennae become comb-like. Then the clavate antennae, the successive segments of the flagellum becomes gradually broader, giving an appearance of club-shaped form to the antennae. Then the capitate antennae. The proximal segments of the flagellum are of uniform size, while the distal segments modified into a large knob or capitula. Then the lamellate antennae. The terminal segments of the flagellum modify into the leaf-like broad plates forming a foliate capitula. Then the geniculate antennae. The antennae are bent completely from the scape pedicel point. And the plumose antennae. The flagellum is composed of large number of cylindrical segments, and the segments are provided with long hairs on either side. In the pilose antennae, the flagellum looks like a shaft flexible hair. All segments are alike fine and tubular but without processes. The aristate antennae. The flagellum is undivided, but the second segment is situated at the different angle on the first segment, and the antenna becomes pendant rather than usual port. The arista developed on the third segment, first segment of the flagellum. The arista may be bare or hairy. Hairs may be developed on either side of the arista as seen in the housefly or above only. Whatever the hairs are developed above the arista, they may be simple as seen in the stable and housefly, or plumose as in the tsetse fly. The stylate antennae. Three-segmented antennae, and third segment divides repeatedly, and thus it becomes falsely multi-segmented, often forming a stylate. Then Brachycera tabanus. And the gnathal appendages. In insects, the gnathal appendages consist of paired mandibles, maxillae, and a labium. The labium is formed due to the fusion of a paired structures, tail, second pair of maxillae. All the structures undergo variable modifications and are adapted for different modes of feeding. Then the mandibles, they are strongly chitinized structures and are commonly known as the jaws. They always articulate in a transverse plane. In the Lepismatidae and Pterygota, the mandibles are dicotylic. They articulate with the primary posterior and the secondary anterior condyles. One condyle, the gingivimus, articulate with the convex process of the clypeus, while the other condyle is set freely to move into a socket at the lower end of the gallery. The rest of the Pterygota and Epimeropteran nymphs, the mandibles are provided with only a single condyle, the primary posterior condyle, which articulate with the head capsule. The mandibles are provided with a strong adductor and abductor muscle arising from the dorsal and lateral walls of the radium. There are also the ventral abductor muscle of the origin of the anterior arms of the tendorium and the ephemerid odonate larvae, and also in the adult Isoptera and Orthoptera except the Acrididae. The mandibles carry out the function of biting and chewing the food materials. In the orthopteroid insects, they are adapted into the sickle or stylets-like piercing organs in some fluid-sucking insects. They are modified into the defensive organs in termites and some beetles. The dentition of mandibles is evolved among different groups of insects in accordance with the food material. In the phytophagous insects, the teeth are blunt like molars. In carnivorous insects, they are slightly pointed like incisors. In carnivorous insects, they are slightly pointed like incisors, while in omnivorous insects, they are of both types, the molars near the base and incisors on the rest of the blade, adapted for cutting as well as grinding the food material. Next will be about maxillae. These are paired structures homologous with the typical first pair of maxillae of the crustaceans and other arthropods. They are also known as the second pair of jaws of the insect. Each maxilla is composed of proximal cardo, middle stipes, lateral pulpifer, inner parasite stipes, or subgalea, and distal sclerate consists of two lobes, inner lacina and outer galea.